to build this, and then I asked around, says, well, how do I go about building this robotic-like thing? And then I met some professors and started joining a lab, building robotic legs as an undergrad. And I wanted to keep going. This was it. This is really what made me happy. So I went to this place called MIT, kept majoring in electrical engineering and computer science, and this is what I built there. And this robot was called COG. It stands for cognition. It's supposed to achieve a 2-year level cognition by spending 5 years of graduate student time. We never quite got there. It's like 15 years later, it's still not there. But it's gotten pretty good. So I've actually built the arms and hands, and then I was exploring in different environment. And I thought the way to go is to start from, just really from scratch, where when we're born, we have reflexes and sort of motivation. So reflex, babies, when you go and touch their hand curl around, I hardwired those into this robotic program, and then legs go if something scratch on the back, for example. And then everything else was done in neural networks, where the computer and the robot actually learn to do the right thing. And that's how we operate, too. We do things wrong, and we learn from those experiences, and we try to do the right thing the next time around. So from just having the robot learning the environment, just trying to experiment with different objects, this robot became to a point it was good enough to grab almost anything in the lab. But it could grab anything, but it couldn't manipulate objects. We seem to have this crazy, amazing hands that we can manipulate any objects in very delicate ways. And we claim that we're better than monkeys because we have those things, right? But we couldn't do that in this robot. We could not provide that dexterous human ability in the robot. And at that point, I realized that, I can't keep pursuing this artificial intelligence or computer science or engineering, whatever it's called. I really have to learn more about the biology and neuroscience. So halfway through my PhD, I just decided, what, I'm not going to do electrical engineering anymore. I'm going to do this thing called computational neuroscience. So that's what I ended up doing for my PhD. And if you looked at my thesis, it looks like a neuroscientist thesis. But you know what? That was a really great experience. And I thought I'd come back after learning everything about neuroscience and then fix all the robotic problems in the world. But you know what? Neuroscience really captivated me, and it still has captivated me, and that has really formed my research area. And there are so many people in the world who have neurological disorders. Stroke, something like 800,000 people get stroke every year, and there are about 6 million people who are around with disabilities, permanent disabilities. There are almost 1 million people who have spinal cord injury, so their neck broke at some point and they can't control the rest of their body. This is just a number within the US. And it turns out, as I was thinking about it, I said, those people can really be helped by some robotic technology that I already know. So rather than helping the robotic technology by knowing neuroscience, why don't we combine it the other way around, which is to help the neurological disorders using the robotic technology that we already know. So that's the direction I ended up going, and I went to this place called Harvard for a postdoc, and then now I ended up in the University of Washington. And I created this field called neurobotics. And this is really, as you can tell from it's a fusion of 2 words, neuroscience and robotics. And I work on really the row, that's really the intersection part. And the moment I say the word neurobotics, a lot of people imagine something like what's on this left-hand side. Maybe this is a laser. Here you go. So really, when I combine a neuro and robotics, people immediately say, oh, so the robotics must be the limbs, and then the neuro must be the brain, and the brain is naturally controlling the limbs. It's true, something I do. This is one of the projects that I'm involved in. But at the same time, I also want you to, in the future, as you walk around in the world and think about the word neurobotics, I want you to also imagine there are robots that you simply interact. Sitting on the table or somewhere in the environment, person goes over and touch it. The moment it touches, just this non-invasive communication allows the robot to know what brain state that you might be in, and the robot would act accordingly and push you in the right way. And now it's a closed-loop communication between your brain signals and the motion, and the robot would also learn to correct its own motion. So we can do things like stroke rehabilitation using stationary robot that's not embedded as part of their body. That's also part of neurobotics. And turns out the visualization in neurobotics was done really well in the 70s already, and this is probably for many of you, it's way too young for this, but this was Star Wars, and then when Luke Skywalker lost the hand fighting against Darth Vader, he got this neurobotics hand, which looks just like his hand, but it's inside its own mechanical system, and as he's thinking about moving his own hand, all those mechanical systems moving inside. Turns out, this is exactly what I'm trying to achieve. And I didn't even have to make my own video. I just violated the copyrights. I got one of my grad students to rent the video and made this clip. So that's really the idea. You know, again, natural brain signal. We don't think anything when we do this. But this is so hard. We can't get robots to do this at all using our neural signals. When we extract everything about our brain signal, we still can't decode what that signal allows us to do this. So it's really complicated. So I figured I'll give you a 1-minute anatomy course so that you can even sort of understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about in terms of integrating neuroscience and robotics. So in terms of the anatomy, and then specifically neuroscience, in the brain, it's all current, electricity going around. And that allows you to think like, I'm thirsty. Maybe I want to reach out for a little glass of water. That signal gets propagated in electricity to the spinal cord. That's like a little tail out of your brain in your spine. And that comes out of the spine and becomes those nerves, still sending current, arrives at the muscle. Muscle has this amazing ability to take those current and then use calcium and potassium and those things that you should eat bananas for, and then turns that muscle current into force, positional displacement, and things like stiffness changes of the limb. And those muscles affect the joints, and then finally affect the behavior. So yeah, I wanted to grab for water. All of that, I thought about it in a current, and then gets propagated to the muscles. Muscles convert that into actual work, and then finally to task and behavior. So that's how humans work. But it turns out, we're going to not worry about the feedback part, even though we have tons of sensory feedback. But I wanted to quickly go into the robotic 1-minute course. So after this, you're going to be an expert in robots. But the structure is quite similar. Robots, well, instead of the brain and the spinal cord, we have a computer. Everything in there is current. It learns. It has pre-structures. It's very similar. Instead of nerves, we have wires. Instead of muscles, we have motors. We have metallic joints. And really, in a way, the structure is quite similar. So now you can start to imagine that if the human body parts in some places are broken, maybe we can start thinking about replacing that with the robotic parts. And that's exactly what the field of neurobotics can be like. So going back to this human structure, let's assume that your friend unfortunately had a car accident and have had major local trauma. Loss, most of the inside is intact, but the limb is gone. In that case, as I've shown you, you can actually place a robotic arm and then connect it back to the nerves that you used to have. And that's exactly this project is about. This project is courtesy of Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. Now there are about 25 people like this walking around in the US who have had the surgery called a nerve reinnervation, where they took the original the nerves that used to go to the arm, that the arm is no longer there, and they're just floating. And the neurosurgeon goes in and rewire those things onto the chest muscle. Then, whenever that person thinks about moving the original thumb that they don't have anymore, the chest muscle actually twitch. Then you can go and retrieve that signal from the skin and then control the robotic device. Robotic device actually, again, is controlled by the current. So those currents that's arriving to the muscle, if you can extract that and then move the robot, that's great. So that's exactly how those people are operating their limbs. And here's a video of one of the guys using it. It's pretty good. He can move multiple joints simultaneously. He has about 4 joints or so in the arm, and then hand can open and close. And whoops, hold on. Technology, okay, that's all I wanted to say here. So this technology, so all those things are just coming up right now. Even though in the movie we've shown that this was going to be available in the 70s, there was huge hype in the 80s with the RoboCop and all those things, but really, finally, this is becoming available in the last 3 to 5 years. But the resolution's limited. There are only about 4 joints that we can move at the same time. Hand has 22 degrees of freedom. This is a very, very complicated system. There's no way we can somehow get that signal out right now. And also, this technology only works for people who just lost the limbs and have everything else intact. But as I said, there are a lot of people in the world who have injuries in the brain or in the spinal cord, and we can't address that issue. So what if we have that problem? What if the spinal cord injury occurred? Healthy brain, but there's no way to propagate information, so they're paralyzed from spinal cord down. We can actually build a robotic device that's wearable. That's something that we built in our lab. And then instead of going through the spinal cord, now we go through an external computer and wires and then send the movement that was commanded from the brain to the robotic device by bypassing their nervous system. So that's what we do. And how do we actually tap into the brain signals? So this is a company out in Connecticut called the Cyberkinetics. They have a technology, they sell this commercially now, to embed actually electronics in the brain surface, really inside, and then push some small needles into the system and the brain. It records electricity from the brain, goes through the external wire. There's a little plug that comes in from the skull, and then goes to the computer. And for this specific video, what this guy can do is by thinking about moving the cursor up and down and side to side, that thought can transform into cursor movement on a computer. And this is extremely useful for people who are so paralyzed to the point that they can't even blink to indicate their intention. There are a lot of people like that out there. So this allows them to press maybe yes and no on the computer. Are you hungry? Are you in pain? All those essential things that they couldn't say anything about because they could not indicate that even though they have this healthy brain inside. Now with this technology, we can actually get those expressions out. We can even display, say, keyboard on the computer screen. Lots of things can happen. But turns out, again, this is also very, very early on in technology. We need actually Angela's help to get this working. But the brain doesn't like having those foreign things inside and ends up rejecting it over time. So or it ends up floating around. So we only had 2 subjects so far who's gone through this trial, and there are infection issues and so forth. So for my research, my collaborators are people who have monkeys. Unfortunately, we work with monkeys, and it's not a vegetarian thing. I'm not a vegetarian either. But I don't work with monkeys because I think they're pretty cute. But I work with people who, enough said. Okay, so here's a guy who has monkeys, and we can now go into their brain signals, and we have extracted the signal and then poured it onto the robotic device. So what we did was train the monkey to reach for food that's placed in the different places. And then we strapped his arms under, and then we put a robotic device, and then used the same brain signal that was used to reach out for food using his own arm, and to control this robotic device. So this is a monkey thinking about wanting to reach for that food. We used the electricity coming from his brain directly onto controlling this robotic arm, reaching out for food, and he can eat it. Okay, so this is the level of technology that we can do now. We can control the robotic endpoint in a 3D to go to where he intends to go. What is primitive here and what's actually faked here is the hand. So this robotic hand that opens and then closes to grab the food, graduate students sitting there with a remote control to make that happen. We just couldn't get that signal from the brain at this point. Okay, that video is kind of cute. And we also want to pay attention. Now we're going to go into smaller sort of detail of the fascination of this hand. But even for building this prosthetic hand is really hard. So those people are typically given something that might look like a hand, but either it doesn't move at all, but it just opens and closes. Again, we're not providing this human-level dexterity that we're talking about. And sad enough, even those are built so poorly to the point that the moment they're done with these experiments, when they go home, they go right back into using a hook. That's how bad they are right now. So we got to fix that problem somehow. And roboticists have been trying to fix that problem for about 25 years now. The roboticists, including myself, there are many of those, actually, I was involved in constructing myself, not the really early on one. But they have 5 fingers, all the right joints, and this has been going on. The only difference that probably is between what was built in 1983 and 2006 are how big the controllers are in the back. These moved really, really slow, required about 2 refrigerators worth of controller electronics. This one actually can be done with electronics that could probably fit in a forearm. So things are improving, but still, if you ask this hand to maybe flip through some pen and do some dexterous operations, you still can't do it. And one of the things that seems to be missing from the field of robotics is an inspiration from biology in the right way. Biology doesn't mean 5 fingers and the right joints, but there are a whole lot more that are in our hand. For example, if you look at this one, this is a very clear example. the palm is rigid. And if you actually look back and even look at like the NASA hand all the way and everything else, the palm is rigid. Come on, have you tried to do anything with a rigid palm? You can't do anything. But all this really, really incredible smart robotics people have gotten together for the last 25 years, and the only thing they built were the robotic hands with the rigid palm. So, but you know, there's a good reason for that. When you start to compromise and figure out what you can do with the current technology, palm is such a great place to put electronics or motors or anything like that. So they end up compromising on those things. But they don't know for sure if that's a good thing to compromise. And I have to say that's not a good thing to compromise, because humans cannot operate with their rigid palm. So we sort of dove into, as our lab, to really pursue what the human level dexterity is. Really try to understand what those biomechanical hardware is and what's the software that's controlling it is like. And then once we understand it, maybe we can start to build the robotic device, and then start to augment some injured people. So this is our first attempt done in 2001. We actually couldn't even find enough information in the literature, so we dissected lots of human hands to get all the parameters that we wanted, and then built this robotic hand over here with a couple of hand surgeons. It performed really well. It did far better than any other robotic hands, to the point that it was in a museum typing keyboard 8 hours a day for 6 weeks. But interestingly, at the end of 6 weeks, we had to keep tweaking the parameters that goes into it, and the robotic hand kept getting harder and harder to operate, and then we got a hand surgeon to come to the museum and have a little evaluation. And he said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your robotic hand has developed arthritis." So turns out if you overuse the robotic system, arthritis occurs, and because there's no cell replacement, it just gets more and more rigid, and eventually just not going to move anymore. So we learned quite a lot by building this device, that certain things we can mimic and certain things we cannot mimic. So we're still in the process of learning exactly what we should mimic, but for the last 6 years, we iterated and iterated and iterated on different designs of fingers, and finally we reached this point. This was just taken this summer. We finally assembled what we feel is really happy, functional, anatomical robotic hand. And it looks quite biological, and then you can see in this motion, I should have shown you other robotic finger movements first, but it's quite biological looking. It can be driven by the human motion itself, as you can see here, or it can be driven by the muscle, the electric signals from the brain that arrives at the muscles that control the finger to also control this robotic finger now. Okay, so it's very biological. We're pretty happy with it. It's difficult to show you all fingers moving together because we don't have that video yet. Hopefully next time. So really, to get there, we had to actually make more biological discoveries. Even though we're contributing to the field of robotics, turns out most of the journal publications happen to be in the science. So we've made discoveries. Actually, how much time do I have?
About
7 minutes. Okay, I'll tell you sort of different things that we've discovered in our lab so far. So one thing we found out was this complicated routing of tendons in your hand. If you shouldn't do this at home, but if you peel the skin off from your hand, you'll see this very, very complex web of tendons in your hand. It's been modeled, but very poorly so far. We've tried to find out, do we really have to mimic all this complicated structure? Maybe it's just an evolutionary garbage. Maybe mimicking those would be a bad idea. It's just too much work. Maybe we can actually find out certain things that we just can extract. So we ran computer simulations, hardware simulations to find out which links and which sort of tendon connections that we can cut out. Unfortunately, it seems like so far the answer has been leaning to the fact that it's an evolutionary marvel. It seems that all those little connections seems to make a lot of sense. Index finger, actually, it can move with 6 muscles. If you try to build a robotic finger that does not have this complicated structure, it's going to require 8 motors to do it. So we somehow became pretty efficient in using only 6 muscles to do all this index finger motion. So there's something very nice about this geometry. We also found out that by having this complicated structure, some of the muscles are used for dual purposes. For that reason, even if you start from the same posture and then have exactly the same current commands coming to the muscles, but if they come in different orders, turns out you end up with different postures. So the timing also matters in terms of the neural signals. The moment we actually mimic this tendon routing and structures, we unfortunately we also figured out that those cylindrical bone structure, which was much easier to build, was not good enough anymore. Humans have those really complicated bumpy surface on the bones, and we thought that it was just some sort of byproduct of the way the bone is built. But turns out we take advantage of those bumps and grooves. For example, one thing that we found out was that, this figure doesn't necessarily show you maybe, but we found out that we're actually naturally strongest in grabbing objects than pushing the finger to push something like a bead sideways. And that function comes purely from the shape of your bone. It's not that you've been training to be stronger in a grabbing direction. That's not what it is. It's actually from the shape of the bones. So by finding out all those facts, unfortunately, we had to machine all those bumpy, groovy bones. And if you've ever tried to use any like CAD or fast prototypes to build bumpy surfaces, those things are so hard. We actually had to spend one staff. I paid him like $80,000 for 2 years just to come up with one set of hand bones that we could use. So it was a very expensive finding in science. And finally, we also wanted to, now we are starting to find a lot of biomechanical or hardware information, but we also were starting to find out a lot about the neural signal, the software part that goes into the hardware. You know that there are billions of neurons in the brain. Those cells all fire and then have lots of currents coming and then eventually somehow ends up in this one behavior. And indeed, we have many different ways to do, say, for example, I'm doing this. I could be doing this in a variety of different ways for my brain to do it. So it's called a redundant control structure. I could have chosen many different ways to do it. That means that, but still, biology somehow picked one solution, one specific way of doing this. Those specific set of neurons fired. So we went back and trying to find out why certain neurons fired and not the other ones. And the way to find out was what's called optimization. We wanted to know if you had a lot of choice to do something, and if you picked one solution, you were optimizing on something. So we thought that maybe if you want to do this many, many times, maybe the brain chooses a structure that's most energy efficient, for example. So we ran some simulation and actually found out that we're not minimizing on the energy. And then we kept running more simulations. And what we found out is that we seem to be somehow optimizing on utilizing as many small muscles as possible and as little of the big muscles as possible whenever we're doing things. I know it doesn't necessarily make sense, and it doesn't make sense for us either. Because if you didn't know anything about muscles, and if you were told that big muscles produce a lot of force, small muscle produces little force, and big muscles have, and then if you combine all those things and then control a limb, maybe you want to use the big muscle a lot. But turns out we do the opposite. And that's something that we actually published and then we hypothesized that when we run with our legs, where energy matters a lot, when big muscles firing a lot, legs might use big muscles more. But for hand tasks, when we manipulate objects, precision makes far more sense than to try to save energy doing the tasks in the hand. So for legs, we found out that people use bigger muscles more often. For hands, we tend to maximize on the utilization of the small muscles. So maybe we actually have those as more like a fine-tuning buttons. So that's so far what we found in terms of the neural control structure. So, and we now are extracting signal from actual people's brain to control our robotic device. Not only from the muscle signals, the currents that arrives to the muscles, but actually the current that exists in the brain. And to do it with the humans without having the infection problems is to simply drill the hole in the bone. That part is easy. Take the bone part off. Then the brain has skin on it. Peel the skin off. But don't go into the actual tissue. Just put electrode right on the surface of the brain. That actually doesn't cause a whole lot of infections. It's actually something that's done routinely for people who have epilepsy. So if you have anybody who has seizure all the time, eventually what they do is that they go into the hospital, put these electrodes on the surface of the brain, sit in the hospital for 4 days or 14 days until they have a seizure, and then those sensors actually detect where the center of the seizure was, and then go in and do the operation. Operation mainly means take out that part of the brain. But usually, those people are sitting in a hospital with all kinds of great brain information pouring out for no reason. So we actually, whenever those epilepsy patients come into the hospital and then they have the sensor grid embedded onto the brain, we come into their hospital room with a cart full of robots and say, excuse me, can we do an experiment with your brain signals? And then we try to get those free brain signals that's pouring out and correlating with the behavior and see how we can use them. So we're starting to really use the neural signal to control this great biomechanical, anatomically correct robotic fingers. I just told you about this pretty narrow area of the neurobotics, but I just wanted to pop you back up to the field, sort of global neurobotics field. This is just a sample of what's going on in my lab alone. So I told you about sort of the prosthetics and brain-machine interface and the anatomical robotic model and how that can help. But we did quite a lot of extensive work also on wearable robotic device. How do we build them? How do we make them light? And then once we have those systems, how do we use the signals to control them? For people who have spinal cord injuries, healthy brain signals, how can we actually bypass them? We also do, as I said, the stationary robotic device to do stroke rehabilitation. Can we come up with a better paradigm? Because now the robot knows exactly what brain state you might be in. And then doing actual biofeedback based on that. And then through that process, of course, we're discovering more and more about the human body. What's interesting is that through neurobotics, turns out all the things I've said, like making scientific discovery we have are obvious, but turns out we're getting funding for a variety of different reasons. For example, what we do can also lead to disease prevention and prediction. By having a person coming and sitting in front of the robot and playing a video game and measuring their precise motion, turns out allow us to detect an onset of certain disease way earlier than the clinical onset or detection. So there's a disease called Huntington's disease, which is similar to Parkinson's disease. Turns out we can detect the onset of their disease up to 7 years prior to the clinical onset using a robotic device. Let's see, what are other interesting ones? Space exploration. We want to send those dexterous robotic hands to Mars and flipping rocks to see if we see bugs underneath it. And currently, we don't have any devices that can do that. So we send humans, well, not on Mars yet, but we send humans for 5 minutes at a time, expose them to radiation and all those things because they're so much more dexterous than any robots out there. But we can start to do that. So NASA is quite interested in doing this. Computer graphics, you see all those, Bugs Life and all those movies, and then those animations get more and more human-like in motions. We're actually contributing a lot to that. The more we understand how humans move and how the biomechanics, how the neurosignal work, those things contribute to those little figures to move much better. So there are a lot of interesting things that come out of neurobotics. Finally, I also wanted to tell you that neurobotics turns out to be great for outreach, and it seems that Angela does quite a lot of the outreach also. But we think it's very important to try to recruit more women and younger people to get excited